Think you know why World War I happened? Think again. Everyone remembers the assassination in Sarajevo, but here's something they don't teach in history class. That trigger was just an excuse? The real story? Europe's wealthiest nations had dug themselves into such a massive financial hole that war became their only way out. I'm talking about debt so crushing that it turned political tensions into economic survival. This wasn't just a military conflict. This was history's biggest debt crisis dressed up in uniforms. Let me take you back to where it actually began, decades before anyone pulled a trigger. The middle of the 19th century changed everything. European rulers figured out a revolutionary trick. Why wait to earn money through slow conquest when you could borrow against future empire growth? Britain jumped in first, taking enormous loans to lay railroad tracks throughout India, construct naval facilities on every ocean, and fund a military machine unlike anything history had witnessed. The formula seemed perfect, provided the empire never stopped expanding and profits kept rolling in. Then the mathematics turned lethal. By the time 1914 rolled around, Britain was drowning in £650 million of national debt, a staggering figure demanding constant attention to interest obligations and endless refinancing cycles. France, Germany, and Russia copied this approach, each piling up debt mountains to chase their colonial dreams. They believed they were playing empire chess. Actually, they were gambling with interest rates that multiplied against them. Consider your home loan as an example. You probably did the math carefully, checked if you could manage the monthly costs, ensured your interest rate made sense, maybe got bank approval before searching for properties. Now picture if everyone on your street was buying properties and then more properties, and suddenly you felt compelled to buy additional properties just to match them. That's precisely what consumed Europe's ruling powers, except their shopping list included warships, standing armies, and entire landmasses. Germany illustrates this imperial debt trap most vividly. Under Kaiser Wilhelm's leadership, German borrowing skyrocketed as they attempted to match British sea power while simultaneously laying railway lines throughout Africa and claiming Pacific islands. German officials convinced themselves that every new territory would become self-funding through extracted resources and commercial activity. Does this ring any bells? It mirrors the reasoning behind our 2008 housing collapse, the assumption that climbing property values would perpetually cover mounting debt obligations. The truly startling revelation emerges when examining the Ottoman Empire, which previewed what happens when imperial debt spirals beyond control. During 1875, the Ottoman government collapsed financially with debts reaching £200 million. Here's the devastating part. Their yearly debt obligations consumed over half their total national income. European lenders refused to accept the losses. Instead, they created the Ottoman Public Debt Administration, granting foreign investors direct authority over Turkish tax systems and budget decisions. Consider the implications for a moment. A sovereign power controlling land across 3 continents effectively became a branch office of European banking houses. Ottoman rulers could maintain their ceremonial dress and hereditary positions, but genuine fiscal authority shifted to London, Paris, and Berlin. This transcended simple debt renegotiation. This became the blueprint for contemporary financial imperialism. The Declaration of London during 1914 formalized this risky system, officially establishing credit as a fundamental component of the Anglo-French-Russian partnership. Military cooperation merged explicitly with financial cooperation. Joining as an ally meant more than promising battlefield support. It meant synchronized borrowing, mutual debt guarantees, and collective assumption of imperial competition risks. Come 1914, every significant European nation was caught in an identical impossible trap. They carried enormous debts demanding constant territorial growth to maintain payments. Yet territorial growth demanded additional borrowing, generating still larger debts. The mathematics had become fundamentally unstable. Something needed to break. Either these empires would discover methods to dramatically boost their income, or they would suffer financial destruction. War, as it happened, provided both an answer and a justification. Military triumph would grant access to conquered lands and natural wealth, potentially fixing the income shortage. Military emergency would legitimize government borrowing levels that peacetime politics could never approve. Most critically, war would permit governments to completely reorganize their fiscal relationships with their populations and international lenders. Those European monarchs weren't building empires. They were accumulating obligations that would ultimately devour everything they pretended to safeguard. This is where things become truly fascinating because by 1916, something without precedent was unfolding in international finance. Britain wasn't merely financing its own conflict. It was covering most imperial expenses, all Italian war expenditures, and two-thirds of French and Russian military spending combined. Stop and think about that. A single nation was basically funding a planetary war involving scores of countries. How is that even financially possible? The explanation involves an international banking network most people remain ignorant about, yet which controlled the destinies of millions. Once you grasp how these monetary arrangements actually functioned, the entire conflict begins resembling less a political struggle and more a giant debt recovery operation with soldiers replacing collection agents. Let's begin with something that should catch our interest. Why was J.P. Morgan Jr., an American financier, arranging military equipment contracts for European forces 2 years before America even joined the fighting? During 1915, Morgan assembled a group of 2,200 American financial institutions to provide a $500 million credit line to the Allied nations. But here's the stunning part. This transcended simple lending. Every British weapons order needed to pass through Morgan companies, granting American bankers direct authority over European military purchasing. Quick question. When foreign banks dictate your military supply networks, do you remain a sovereign power or have you transformed into something different entirely? Britain, the empire governing 1/4 of global territory, had essentially handed its war financing to Wall Street. The Lion was requesting funds from the Eagle to purchase ammunition. Yet the genuinely extraordinary element is what occurred with borrowing costs during this time. As European governments borrowed increasing amounts to fund their military activities, the price of borrowing continued rising. Climbing interest rates meant territorial expansion wasn't merely politically attractive. It became mathematically essential. You required new income sources simply to service your current debt, never mind financing additional military operations. France and Russia discovered themselves in particularly precarious circumstances. Their gold stockpiles, which had been exceeding those of the Bank of England according to financial documentation from that era, became vital leverage in partnership discussions. When negotiating military partnerships, you're not simply promising coordinated fighting. You're promising to share the burden of maintaining each other's government solvency. This is where things become almost bizarre. Germany's Reichsbank was extending short-term credit to the government while war bonds consolidated long-term obligations, producing what financial scholars now identify as an early form of debt monetization. The German state was essentially creating currency to pay interest on funds it had previously borrowed to finance military ventures that were supposed to generate sufficient spoils to repay the initial loans. Sound recognizable? It mirrors the pattern that produced our 2008 economic meltdown. Except rather than mortgage-backed instruments, European nations were wagering on victory-backed instruments. Each new military operation was expected to become self-financing through territorial seizure, resource harvesting, and compensation payments from vanquished opponents. The Bank of England, Rothschilds, Barings, Morgans, Kleinwers, and Schroeders, London's dominant merchant banking houses, controlled international investment projects and held massive financial positions in European conflict outcomes. These weren't detached observers offering banking assistance. They were engaged stakeholders whose investment portfolios required specific military results. Let me contextualize this with a contemporary comparison. Imagine if Goldman Sachs, J.P. Morgan Chase, and Bank of America had each extended billions to opposing sides in some regional struggle, with repayment terms hinging on who achieved victory. Now imagine these same banks also dominated the arms suppliers for each faction. Would these banks maintain neutrality, or would they possess powerful motivations to shape the result? That's precisely what transpired in Europe between 1914 and 1918. International credit had generated reciprocal dependencies where lending nations held invested interests in their borrowers' military achievements. When Britain extended credit to France and Russia, British financial institutions weren't merely anticipating loan recovery. They were gambling on Allied triumph. When German banks financed Austrian military activities, they were placing identical wagers on Central Power's success. The outcome was a financial architecture where military failure signified not merely political embarrassment, but total economic devastation. Losing the conflict meant defaulting on international obligations. losing entry to worldwide credit systems and confronting the type of foreign fiscal domination that had already befallen the Ottoman Empire. By 1916, credit limitations and climbing interest costs had rendered territorial expansion the sole workable approach for preventing insolvency. European nations weren't battling for prestige or ethnic pride or even tactical positioning. They were fighting to escape the financial version of property seizure. The conflict had evolved into a colossal game of musical chairs, where whoever ceased fighting first would confront complete economic annihilation. This explains why the conflict intensified so rapidly and became so savagely comprehensive. Achieving a few battlefield wins or negotiating a reasonable settlement wasn't sufficient. Each faction required absolute triumph to generate adequate plunder and compensation to satisfy their international lenders. Anything short of complete victory signified financial catastrophe that would persist for generations. The human toll of this financial reasoning was enormous. But the banking apparatus had produced incentives making peace more threatening than war for heavily indebted nations. When your national existence depends on borrowed capital, and your borrowing capacity depends on winning military engagements, you cannot afford the luxury of selecting peace. Now we arrive at the segment of this account that fundamentally alters how you comprehend America's participation in World War I. You've likely heard that the United States attempted remaining neutral until German naval warfare left us no choice. That represents the official narrative. The actual narrative involves a figure named J.P. Morgan Jr. and history's greatest financial wager. Visualize Morgan in his Wall Street headquarters during 1915, surrounded by European maps marked with red indicators showing battlegrounds where American capital was financing the carnage. At this stage, Morgan had arranged credit totaling $1.5 billion to the Allied nations. That equals approximately $35 billion in current valuation. Yet here's what makes this genuinely astonishing. Morgan wasn't simply extending credit. He was effectively operating Britain's complete military acquisition system from Manhattan. Every British munitions acquisition, every French weapons shipment, every Russian firearm agreement needed to pass through Morgan Enterprises. The individual controlling Allied weapons distribution was an American banker whose earnings required maintaining the conflict long enough for the Allies to achieve decisive victory. Consider the conflicting interests present. Morgan possessed every monetary motivation to block peace discussions that might terminate the war before the Allies could produce sufficient resources to satisfy their American obligations. Yet Morgan represented merely the starting point. By 1917, circumstances had grown far beyond private banking. The United States Treasury was providing enormous credits directly to European states, with America lending beyond $10 billion to foreign powers, an astronomical figure that revolutionized the planetary financial architecture immediately. The United States transitioned from being a net international borrower of $3.2 billion during 1914 to becoming the planet's dominant creditor power by 1918. Now consider the timing. The Federal Reserve, America's central banking apparatus, was established during 1913, merely 1 year before war commenced. Pure chance? The Fed supplied the organizational structure enabling massive war debt expansion. Without the Federal Reserve's capacity to expand currency supply and synchronize with private institutions, the magnitude of American lending to Europe would have proven financially unachievable. Let's discuss what this signified in concrete terms. American involvement in the war transcended submarines or diplomatic friction. By 1917, American financial institutions and the U.S. state had extended such enormous sums to the Allied nations that an Allied loss would have sparked the most severe financial crisis in American experience. Morgan and his partners weren't simply wishing for Allied victory. They absolutely required it to prevent their own bankruptcy. Consider this situation. You've loaned your complete savings to someone who's engaged in conflict with another party. If your associate loses the confrontation, you never recover your funds. If your associate prevails, you receive your funds back with additional returns. Will you maintain neutrality in that confrontation, or will you take every possible action to assist your associate's victory? That's precisely the situation America discovered itself in by 1917. The shift was extraordinary. Within merely 3 years, the United States progressed from neutral spectator to active combatant, not driven by political philosophy or military planning, but driven by financial vulnerability. American participation converted inter-allied credits from a mixed public-private system into direct state-to-state lending arrangements. with the United States as the supreme global lender. Yet, here's the element that should genuinely capture our focus. While European nations were destroying themselves in combat trenches, American industrial strength was multiplying. Enormous allied acquisitions of American armaments, provisions, and materials reversed our international debt standing and created the basis for American economic supremacy that would continue for the following century. Morgan and his partners had essentially determined how to profit from European self-annihilation. They weren't financing a conflict. They were financing the relocation of worldwide economic authority from European empires to American financial enterprises. Every artillery round detonated in France, every armored vehicle crossing Belgian territory, every naval vessel destroyed in the Atlantic symbolized loan installments flowing from European treasuries to American institutions. The human tragedy here is overwhelming. European troops were perishing in trenches to protect investment portfolios held by American financiers who had never witnessed combat. Young individuals from British countryside and German towns were destroying each other to establish whether Morgan's credits would be recovered in British currency or whether they would collapse completely. When America officially joined the war during 1917, our involvement was fundamentally unavoidable. We weren't selecting sides according to democratic principles or humanitarian motivations. We were defending a financial commitment that had expanded too significantly to collapse. American soldiers transported to European combat zones weren't defending liberty or representative government. They were fighting to recover on obligations that European nations owed to American institutions. The magnitude of this financial engineering becomes evident when examining the figures. Between Morgan's private consortium and direct treasury credits, American financial organizations dictated the result of the planet's biggest military engagement. European empires that had controlled international matters for centuries discovered themselves financially reliant on a country that most had regarded as a former territory just decades previously. This wasn't coincidental. The identical financial organizations that had generated expansion and contraction patterns in American railway development and industrial growth had merely expanded their activities to encompass entire continents. They had determined how to profit from international struggle on a magnitude that earlier generations could never have conceived. The genuine brilliance of the American stance was that we profited irrespective of conflict duration or casualty numbers. Extended conflict signified additional loan interest, increased weapons transactions, and expanded opportunities to establish financial supremacy over European rivals. American institutions had discovered the ideal commercial formula, extending funds to all conflict participants while dominating the supply networks that establish military results. Now we reach the point when the complete financial structure becomes apparent, and you'll comprehend why the war to conclude all wars actually created the permanent debt-dependent international architecture we continue inhabiting currently. What occurred following the ceasefire wasn't harmony. It was the biggest debt reorganization activity in human experience disguised as treaty discussions. Here's the shocking truth. By 1919, the United Kingdom's national obligations had multiplied from £706 million during 1914 to £7,481 million by war's conclusion. That represents more than tenfold the initial figure. France, Russia, and Germany confronted comparable debt explosions that rendered normal peacetime administration financially unachievable. These weren't merely large figures. They represented commitments that would consume national finances for generations. Yet the genuine discovery emerges when tracing the monetary circulation following Versailles. Germany was obligated to deliver massive compensation to Britain and France. Yet here's the complexity. Germany financed those compensation deliveries with credits from American institutions. Britain and France subsequently utilized German compensation funds to satisfy their obligations to the United States. The complete arrangement was a circular debt structure where American institutions were essentially lending Germany funds to deliver compensation that would return to American lenders. Let me guide you through this financial deception systematically. Between 1919 and 1932, Germany delivered 19 billion gold marks in compensation to the Allied nations. During the identical timeframe, Germany obtained 27 billion gold marks in credits from American institutions. Germany was borrowing more funds than it was delivering. Yet the compensation deliveries established a legal structure for permanent financial oversight of German domestic administration. Consider what this signifies. The Treaty of Versailles wasn't genuinely a harmony agreement. It was a debt recovery mechanism that positioned American financial organizations as the ultimate authorities of European economic administration. German compensation, British war debt deliveries, and French reconstruction credits all circulated through the identical American banking systems that had financed the initial struggle. The human expense of this structure was staggering, yet it intensifies when recognizing that European administrations comprehended precisely what they were authorizing. According to financial documentation from the time frame, European leaders had borrowed during the conflict, presuming they were protecting civilization. Yet they discovered that Americans approached international lending as commercial investment focused on profit maximization rather than supporting allied countries. This generated a fundamental conflict in anticipations that would characterize international affairs for the following century. European nations anticipated debt forgiveness or advantageous restructuring founded on collective sacrifice and shared principles. American lenders anticipated complete recovery with interest founded on conventional commercial provisions. When those anticipations collided, the outcome was economic strategies that emphasized debt payments over human prosperity. The magnitude of this financial authority becomes evident when examining how extended these commitments continued. The concluding payment of German World War I obligations wasn't completed until October 3, 2010. Absorb that again. 2010. Germany invested 92 years satisfying obligations for a conflict that continued 4 years. British war debt deliveries to the United States persisted until 2006. France didn't complete satisfying its World War I commitments until 2009. This signifies that individuals who were born decades following the ceasefire invested their complete working existence paying taxes to fulfill obligations incurred by administrations that had disappeared before their grandparents were born. The conflict had concluded, yet the financial commitments established a permanent architecture of international wealth relocation that functioned regardless of shifting political situations. Yet here's the segment that should genuinely ignite our anger. While ordinary Europeans invested the following century satisfying this financial structure, the banking organizations that generated the debt spiral became more dominant and profitable than previously. World War I created the framework for contemporary sovereign debt emergencies, where military struggles function as opportunities for financial organizations to create permanent income channels through government borrowing. The configuration repeats throughout the 20th century and persists currently. International struggles generate emergency borrowing circumstances that permit financial organizations to create long-term authority over national economic strategies. Debt fulfillment demands subsequently determine domestic priorities for generations, regardless of democratic choices or shifting political administration. When you comprehend this arrangement, current developments begin making more logic. Why do sovereign debt emergencies consistently produce austerity strategies that advantage international lenders while transferring expenses to ordinary populations? Why do military struggles consistently produce increased government borrowing rather than reduced international conflicts? Why do harmony discussions consistently involve intricate financial structures that appear to matter more than territorial or political settlements? The explanation is that World War I created a precedent where international struggles function primarily as debt consolidation activities rather than political or territorial conflicts. Contemporary wars aren't conducted to address international disagreements. They're conducted to generate financial commitments that produce permanent income channels for international lenders. Those European monarchs we commenced with, assembling in elaborate palaces with writing instruments positioned over significant documents, they weren't authorizing agreements expanding their empires. They were authorizing loan contracts that would ultimately bankrupt their countries and create a worldwide financial arrangement where human prosperity became secondary to debt fulfillment demands. The war to conclude all wars didn't conclude war. It rendered war financially advantageous on a permanent foundation. Every international struggle since 1918 has adhered to the identical fundamental configuration. Emergency borrowing generates long-term financial commitments that outlive the initial political conflicts by decades. We're not inhabiting a reality determined by the results of historical struggles. We're inhabiting a reality determined by the financial structures that finance those struggles. And that, beyond any assassination or partnership arrangement or imperial competition, clarifies why our current international architecture emphasizes financial stability over human protection, debt fulfillment over democratic administration, and lender privileges over national independence. The financiers prevailed in World War I and were all continuing to satisfy their victory.